The fuller story came to be in 2017, and it was during a time when Confederate iconography was a controversial touch point in our country, and people were taking down monuments all over the South. Some of it was an uproar coming out of what happened in Charleston, South Carolina, with the killing of 9 black people in a local church, Mother Emanuel. And then there was what happened in Charlottesville with the removal of a Robert E. Lee statue. So at this time, statues were coming down, whether forcefully or legally. And so when the events transpired in Charlottesville at the time, and a young lady named Heather Heyer was murdered, we gathered in Franklin, Tennessee on the square to have a prayer meeting. So there were several pastors there, and one of them was a friend of mine named Kevin Riggs. And Kevin Riggs was interviewed by the local media, and he made some kind of comment about the statue in the center of the city of Franklin should come down. And as a result of that, that caused more controversy within our own city. At this particular prayer meeting that day, which occurred in the rain, Eric Jacobson, a local historian, was there as well, and he heard Kevin's comments, and he asked if the two of them could get together just to discuss the future of Franklin and the statue, affectionately known as Chip, in the center of town. And so at that meeting, Eric began to share ideas about what about if we talked about leaving the statue up. And so he made a suggestion about let's leave it up and let's talk about other aspects of our history, because if you take the statue down, the history doesn't go anywhere. But there's so many other dimensions to the story of the Civil War and what happened in Franklin that most people don't know. And so as they were having this conversation, Kevin said, this sounds good what you're saying, but I need to bring some other people that I know into this discussion, namely African American men. And so that's where myself and Hewitt Sawyers were contacted to join this discussion. And so in the midst of that discussion, where we met for weeks and months on end, talking about history that Eric made known to us that we didn't know about, especially a history that connected my ancestors, the people that I descended from, as far as the enslaved, things I learned that I never knew of, having lived in Franklin for many, many years. At this time, over 25 years living in Franklin. And so we were enthralled by these stories, and we felt if we didn't know these stories as leaders in the community, how much more do people not know these stories? So as a result of meeting and talking and learning, praying together, the fuller story was birthed out of that. And it was really a way to look at how to deal with the challenge of these statues in a way that was productive for the community. And so that's where the fuller story came about. And we started off with putting up markers on the square that told of different historical events that happened, either right there on the square or in the city of Franklin, where we talked about a riot that occurred in 1867. That was one of the markers. We also talked about a market house that pretty much was the main one that was in the center of town, connected to the first courthouse where people would buy enslaved individuals there. And then we talked about Reconstruction and things like that. So those markers were approved by the city. And part 2, or plan B, of our initiative was to put up a life-size statue of a United States Colored Troop soldier, because in front of the historic courthouse, we learned from Eric that it was in that courthouse that once the Emancipation Proclamation went forth, that many of the enslaved in the area came to the courthouse in order to go from being slaves to being soldiers to fight in the Federal Army. And so we were able to raise the money for that, and again have full approval by the city and the county to be able to place that statue in front of the courthouse. So that's how the fuller story got started. It was about a 4-year project from 2017 into 2021, coming through COVID, but the community got behind it. They wanted something positive. They wanted something solution-oriented. And we as community leaders wanted to prepare our city, because if it could happen in Charlottesville, if it could happen in Charleston, South Carolina, it could happen in Franklin, Tennessee, as far as there being uprisings, primarily set ablaze because of race. And so we wanted to be proactive as opposed to being reactive. So we wanted to have representation of not only telling the truth, but representation of a man of color, a black man with a rifle in his hand who fought for this nation. And so people got behind it, and it was and is a beautiful story. Well, when people see the statue, which is called March to Freedom, in the center of Franklin, adjacent to Chip, he's affectionately known, we see people who see something that's very rare, because there may not be more than a dozen of these kinds of statues in the country, yet alone with that kind of proximity. As one of the aldermen in Franklin called it, a place of equal nobility. And so it's a rare thing to see. But with the marker being there, it also tells the story. So it's a great place to teach your children, for us to learn ourselves of the dignity that these soldiers, upwards of 200,000 enlisted into the Army and the Navy to fight for freedom that they weren't even necessarily guaranteed if the North won. But thankfully, they were able to eventually get freedom. But their bravery when they were doubted, their bravery when they weren't given the same kind of uniform and materials, boots, weaponry to do the fight, or they were doubted because they were slaves and people questioned their intelligence, and yet they were able to push through all of that. So it's a remarkable example of who we were as a people, who we are as a people as far as black people, and what we've done in this country. So the way the sculpture was designed by the sculptor, Joe Frank Howard, is that the soldier has his foot on a tree stump, and there are chains that are broken at his feet. So it speaks of the fact that his identity is not solely connected to being enslaved, but his foot being on the tree stump speaks of taking authority over once had authority over him, the tree of bondage, the tree of suffering. And he's standing there again, very triumphant, very confident, and he is holding a rifle, not holding a ladle or pitchfork or a shovel. But again, it speaks of his dignity and his humanity. So when people see it, they're blown away. You look at it, you see so many different things because he puts so many different artistic images in the statue that you walk away with something different every time you see it. But to know that he is there, downtown Franklin, man, it does my heart glad. I'm so thankful that Franklin took the lead in doing something like this, because it has definitely impacted other communities, especially the place where the Ku Klux Klan was founded, just down the road. Many of their leaders came from Pulaski, Tennessee. They came when we unveiled the statue, and they were encouraged by that, and they have since adopted a similar kind of vision and display in Pulaski, Tennessee. So this story has moved many hearts, to the degree where there were over 1 billion media hits from this story. Because again, I think it resonated with so many hearts, and it showed again what we can be if we come together. So in the fuller story, you had 2 black men and 2 white men working together. So it's not only just an example of putting the markers in the statue up, it's what we embodied as a community. So people definitely were inspired, and if it can happen in Franklin, it can happen anywhere. But it takes people being willing to humble themselves, to listen, and not just talk all the time. Well, this story affects me personally, because when I first came to Tennessee from Baltimore, one of the things I kept hearing about the Civil War was that it was fought over states' rights, as if that didn't speak of the right of states to own slaves in the South. But it was just a way of trying to minimize the savage impact on my people, to try to make it seem like it was more of a governmental thing that didn't include what happened in a barbaric way to millions of people who came from Africa. And so when you start telling the truth, yeah, it was states' right, but it was states' rights to defend slavery. that's so important because I want to be able to see myself in history and not be glossed over to make white people feel better or not feel the shock or the guilt even of what happened. So I need to know what the truth is. My grandson needs to know what the truth is, that we are important enough to be included in the story, and not just the part about being enslaved, but what happened since then. So looking at the statue, it causes me to think of the movie Glory with Denzel Washington and Morgan Freeman, that you saw the courage in these men and what they had to grapple with in that time. So personally, it makes me proud, or prouder, to be a black man in the South, knowing where I come from and where I'm going. We were able as a community to celebrate Juneteenth in downtown Franklin, which was really a first, that African American people were able to have sole usage of the square in order to celebrate Juneteenth. And a lot of that came out of what was going on with the Fuller story. So to be able to go downtown and know that, again, we made history, to be able to come out and use downtown and to celebrate Juneteenth made me all the more feel a part of the community and not just someone who's off on the periphery, off on the side, but we have just as much a stake in this community as anyone else. And I'm thankful for our local government in the ways that they have gotten behind us as a community and uplifted us and helped to tell our stories. So that's what I look to do.